Hey guys, tonight we dive into the forgotten story of Anarcha Westcott, a woman whose name most likely doesn't ring any bells. Yet, she holds a deeply unsettling place in the history of modern medicine. Imagine yourself back in the 1800s. Gritty, dusty roads, the smell of smoke hanging in the air from small fires, the buzz of life moving at a slower pace but tinged with the weight of racial and social injustice. Anarcha wasn't a character in some historical novel. She was a real person, an enslaved woman whose life was woven into the very fabric of a chilling, yet pivotal chapter in medical history. You might be wondering, what does this have to do with me? Well, Anarcha's pain and suffering were key to some of the earliest advancements in gynecology. But here's the kicker, she didn't sign up for any of this. In fact, she was subjected to cruel experimentation by Dr. J. Marion Sims, a name many medical professionals might know. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love hearing where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As we move through Anarcha's story, remember, you probably won't survive this unscathed, because the truth can sometimes be more painful than fiction. Buckle up, this is going to be a ride. Now that you're settled, let's set the stage. It's the early 19th century, a time when the idea of medical progress was still in its infancy. In many ways, it was a brutal time to be alive, particularly for women, and even more so for enslaved women like Anarcha Westcott. Picture it, fields stretching far and wide under a sun that feels oppressive, a small cabin tucked away where the enslaved lived out their days in toil. Imagine the sound of chains clinking, the harsh orders shouted by overseers, the endless labor in the fields. But within this world of oppression, there's a flicker of something darker. This is where Anarcha's story begins to intertwine with medical history. The place is Alabama, and the time is around the 1840s. Dr. J. Marion Sims, a prominent figure in medicine, made a name for himself as he pioneered the field of gynecology. But here's the thing, his methods? Well, they were far from conventional, to say the least. His studies would eventually become one of the darkest chapters in medical experimentation. But before he made history as a medical innovator, he was just a struggling doctor. You could say he was looking for a way to make his mark, and the circumstances of the time gave him just the opportunity he needed. In his search for solutions to women's health problems, Sims found himself experimenting on enslaved women, women who had no say in the matter. Anarcha was one of these women. Little is known about her early life, but we do know she was one of the many enslaved individuals used by Sims for his experiments. Historians still argue whether Sims' actions were motivated by desperation or a twisted sense of medical curiosity. But either way, the reality is that Anarcha's suffering would go on to contribute to medical knowledge in ways she could never have foreseen. Now let's zoom in on Dr. J. Marion Sims. He's the kind of historical figure who's hailed as a father of modern gynecology. But it's hard to know what to make of that when you dig a little deeper. By all accounts, Sims was an ambitious doctor who sought to make a name for himself in the field of women's health, particularly dealing with the troubling issue of fistulas, painful conditions that result from childbirth injuries. In his mind, he had a solution: surgery. But here's where it all starts to get uncomfortable. Sims wasn't interested in just performing surgery on any willing patient. He needed subjects who couldn't consent, women who would never be able to say no. And so, he turned to enslaved women like Anarcha. In 1845, he began conducting his surgeries without anesthesia, on women who had no choice but to endure the procedures. This was done in the name of medical science, of course, but there was something deeply wrong about this approach. It's important to understand that this wasn't just a case of a few isolated incidents. This was a series of surgeries that went on for years, with Anarcha being one of the most frequently used subjects. The irony here is that while Sims was performing these brutal experiments, he was also innovating. He invented the speculum and developed new surgical techniques, many of which we still use in gynecology today. But no one talks about the suffering that went into those discoveries, the women who had no voice in the process. And Anarcha? She underwent countless surgeries, each more excruciating than the last. The fact that she survived this, let alone became a part of medical history, speaks volumes about her resilience. Historians still argue whether Sims should be remembered for his medical breakthroughs or condemned for his exploitation. It's a complicated issue, one that doesn't have an easy answer. But it's clear that Anarcha was an unwilling participant in what would become a legendary chapter in medicine, and her story is one that has largely been erased. Let's turn our focus back to Anarcha. By all accounts, she was one of the most frequently experimented upon by Sims, and it was in the sterile, dimly lit rooms of his medical setup that she first encountered the sharp sting of his surgical tools. Anarcha's first surgery was performed in 1845, but this wasn't just any routine operation. No, it was a procedure performed without anesthesia, an excruciating experience that was not uncommon for the enslaved women used in Sims' experiments. This was the brutal reality of medical history. Pain was part of the process, and consent was a concept no one bothered to ask for. Imagine being Anarcha in that moment. You've been thrust into a world where your body isn't truly your own, where every part of your being is up for examination, trial, and error. You're treated as an object for a doctor's scientific curiosity, and the promise of any relief is nothing more than a distant dream. Yet, despite the unimaginable suffering she endured, Anarcha survived surgery after surgery. Each time, she returned for more, as Sims continued to test his theories and refine his techniques. At times, her pain was unbearable, and there are accounts that suggest she screamed during some of the procedures. But through it all, she remained a silent witness to the advancement of medicine, her name erased from the pages of history. It's unsettling to think about the sheer power imbalance here. Anarcha had no voice, no control, and no way to refuse. Historians still argue whether Sims' work was an essential breakthrough for women's health or an unforgivable violation of human rights. What is undeniable, however, is the toll that these experiments took on Anarcha and the other enslaved women involved. Sims claimed to have treated his patients with great care, but the reality was far from that. It's also worth noting that Sims, for all his medical advancements, didn't really seek to make his experiments ethical. He had no regard for the autonomy of the women he operated on, treating them as mere vessels for his science. It's a tragic irony that the progress in gynecology came at the cost of so much human suffering, all hidden under the guise of medical necessity. Let's pause for a moment and really sit with the harsh reality of what Anarcha went through. These weren't just one-off surgeries. This was a systematic process of experimentation. Sims wasn't just refining his technique in a single operation. He was performing multiple surgeries over years, testing his ideas on Anarcha's body time and time again. Without anesthesia, it's hard to fathom the sheer level of pain and trauma she endured for the sake of someone else's medical career. In fact, it's almost as if her suffering was an afterthought, just a footnote in the story of progress. But here's where it gets even darker. These medical trials were not only conducted without consent, they were also performed without proper hygiene standards. Sims' methods were far from revolutionary in terms of sterilization. Surgical tools were often reused without being cleaned, and the idea of sanitation was largely foreign to many at the time. This meant that every procedure, while it may have advanced Sims' understanding of gynecology, was also a breeding ground for infections. Some of the women involved developed severe complications, but their pain and suffering were seen as secondary to the scientific experiment. What's even more shocking is that Anarcha wasn't the only one subjected to these brutal surgeries. Several other enslaved women were used as subjects in Sims' experiments, and they too had to endure the same kind of suffering. Yet, despite their enormous contribution to the field, they were never compensated or even acknowledged. Their stories remained hidden in the shadows of medical history, their voices muffled by the centuries of oppression they endured. Historians still argue whether it was possible for Sims to achieve the medical advancements he did without exploiting enslaved women. Could he have tested his theories in a more ethical manner? The debate continues, and it's one that raises uncomfortable questions about medical ethics, consent, and the exploitation of marginalized groups. The fact that Anarcha, along with others like her, became central to Sims' breakthroughs means that their suffering is inseparable from the history of gynecology. Let's take a step back for a moment and think about the larger picture. While Anarcha's painful experiences and Sims' surgeries are central to this story, there's an important question that we still grapple with today. Was this level of experimentation justifiable for the advancement of medicine? It's easy to point fingers and condemn Sims, but when you look at the context of the time, there's more complexity than meets the eye. In the early 1800s, medical knowledge was still in its infancy, especially when it came to surgical practices. The tools were crude, anesthesia was practically non-existent, and the understanding of hygiene was rudimentary at best. For doctors like Sims, the lines between ethical responsibility and medical progress were incredibly blurred. The idea of informed consent, a foundational principle in modern medicine, didn't exist in the same way it does now. Sims may have seen his work as necessary, and perhaps he justified his actions by believing he was helping future generations of women. Historians still argue whether Sims was a product of his time or a man who could have, and should have, known better. Did his experiments push the boundaries of medical knowledge, or did they represent a deep moral failure? One thing is clear: the consequences of his work were both groundbreaking and grotesque. He invented tools and techniques that are still in use today, but at what cost? And were these advancements worth the pain and suffering of the women who were treated as mere instruments in his experiments? There's also the uncomfortable truth that Sims' success in gynecology was a byproduct of systemic racism. The enslaved women he experimented on were not given any agency in the process. They were denied even the most basic human rights, including the right to decide what happened to their bodies. That's a massive power imbalance, and it's one that casts a long shadow over the legacy of Sims and his work. What makes this even more chilling is that the history of medical experimentation on enslaved individuals wasn't isolated to Sims. His story is a part of a much larger, painful pattern in the history of medicine, a pattern that ignored the voices of marginalized groups for the sake of progress. It's a pattern that still influences the way we think about ethics in modern science. As we continue, let's take a moment to reflect on the concept of freedom in the context of Anarcha's life. The notion of freedom, especially for an enslaved woman like her, was an illusion, a cruel twist of fate. She was a part of the fabric of a society built on the exploitation of black bodies, yet in the eyes of the system, her autonomy didn't exist. Her body was not her own, it was controlled, manipulated, and ultimately used for someone else's gain. But even as Anarcha was bound by the chains of slavery, there was a glimmer of personal resilience. Even in the midst of unspeakable suffering, Anarcha continued to endure, to survive, to somehow remain present in the face of her torturous reality. Her ability to withstand these horrors speaks to a strength that transcends mere survival. It's a quiet act of resistance. While she may not have had the legal or physical freedom that others take for granted, in some sense, her survival became her defiance. At the same time, her sense of freedom was undoubtedly shaped by the brutal system she was a part of. Her worth wasn't measured by who she was as a person but by her ability to labor, to produce, and to contribute to the economic engine of slavery. And yet, there's something uniquely human in her story. In spite of the dehumanizing circumstances, Anarcha's story carries with it an undeniable sense of agency, even if it wasn't recognized by the world around her. In a way, the suffering she endured within the confines of slavery was part of a larger, more painful cycle of exploitation that is only now beginning to be fully acknowledged. As we reflect on her life, we must also ask ourselves, what does freedom mean, not just in the physical sense, but in the moral and ethical sense? Anarcha's life, as much as it was defined by oppression, also represents the enduring fight for autonomy, dignity, and recognition. Historians still argue whether we can fully comprehend the impact of the slavery system on the medical field without confronting its racial and gender-based implications. Can we ever fully reckon with the past? And does our understanding of freedom change when we recognize the ways in which people like Anarcha were subjected to an unspeakable loss of it? Now that we've considered Anarcha's life in its broader context, let's return to her legacy, or rather, the lack of it. Anarcha Westcott's name, along with the names of the other enslaved women who were experimented upon by Dr. Sims, faded into the dark corners of history. For years, these women were regarded as little more than instruments for medical progress, their identities and suffering erased. The contributions they made to the field of gynecology were undeniable, yet their stories remained silenced. Anarcha's legacy, in particular, is all but invisible in the history books. While Sims was praised as the father of modern gynecology, the enslaved women who suffered under his scalpel were forgotten. Their bodies were the testing ground for revolutionary medical advancements, but their identities were never celebrated, their names never spoken aloud. It wasn't until long after Sims' death that the history of these women began to surface in the broader historical conversation. But by then, their voices were lost forever. The irony of Anarcha's erasure is that the procedures she endured laid the foundation for advances in women's health that continue to save lives today. Yet her pain, and the pain of the other women, was never acknowledged in the same way. Their suffering wasn't something that could be recognized as part of a noble, scientific effort. It was something that was too uncomfortable, too inconvenient for the medical establishment to address for many years. It wasn't until the feminist and civil rights movements brought attention to the exploitation of black bodies in medical history that Anarcha's story began to see the light of day. Historians still argue whether modern medicine has done enough to reckon with the legacy of exploitation and racism within its own history. Is it possible to separate the advancement of science from the ethical compromises that made those advancements possible? Or must we come to terms with the painful reality that progress in some fields often comes at the cost of those who are most vulnerable? Anarcha's name, though long silenced, now serves as a symbol for all the other women whose stories have been erased. We may never know everything about her life, but her quiet resistance to the exploitation she endured continues to resonate. Let's step back for a moment and look at the man at the center of this tragic story, Dr. J. Marion Sims. Sims' legacy is complicated, to say the least. On one hand, he's often hailed as a pioneer in gynecology, with many of his medical practices forming the foundation of women's health care today. His invention of the speculum and other surgical techniques paved the way for breakthroughs in treating diseases like vesicovaginal fistulas, an injury that women sometimes suffered during childbirth, causing painful and life-altering complications. These advancements, crucial to modern gynecology, would have saved countless lives if they had been developed under more ethical circumstances. On the other hand, Sims' methods, his use of enslaved women as unwilling subjects in his experiments, cannot be ignored. The medical progress he achieved was built on the backs of those who had no choice but to endure his surgeries. Anarcha Westcott, as one of his most frequently experimented upon subjects, endured excruciating pain time and time again, all without anesthesia. While Sims went on to become a respected figure in medicine, Anarcha and the other enslaved women were left behind, their suffering rendered invisible. Historians still argue whether it's possible to separate Sims' medical contributions from the ethical violations that made them possible. Was Sims a man of his time, caught between the need for scientific advancement and the deeply flawed racial and moral landscape of the 19th century? Or was he a man who took advantage of a system that allowed him to exploit black bodies without consequence? What complicates the debate further is the fact that his innovations are still in use today, making it all the harder to reconcile his medical genius with his exploitation of vulnerable women. Ultimately, Sims' legacy raises troubling questions about the intersection of science, ethics, and power. How do we reconcile the good that comes from medical advancements with the harm done to those who suffered for them? Can we truly celebrate his contributions without acknowledging the price that women like Anarcha paid? The discussion around Sims' legacy brings us to the crucial issue of justice, both historical and modern. For many years, Anarcha and the other enslaved women who were subjected to Sims' experiments received no recognition, no acknowledgement of the pain they endured, and certainly no apology. But over time, a movement to right these wrongs began to take shape. Activists, historians, and scholars have worked tirelessly to bring attention to the abuses that took place under Sims' watch, And in doing so, they have shone a light on the forgotten women who helped shape modern gynecology. In recent years, there has been a push to give these women the recognition they deserve. Some believe that Anarcha and the others should be honored publicly, with monuments or historical markers dedicated to their contribution to medical progress. However, this idea is not without controversy. Can a historical monument ever adequately express the magnitude of what these women endured? Or is it a mere token gesture, a way to assuage our collective guilt without truly reckoning with the historical trauma? What makes the conversation around justice for Anarcha particularly complicated is the fact that many people in the medical field still consider the advancements made by Sims to be essential to modern practice. His contributions to gynecology cannot be undone, and they continue to help women around the world today. But does that make up for the harm caused by his methods? Can we honor the good without confronting the deep injustice that accompanied it? Historians still argue whether it's possible to move on from this dark chapter in medical history. Should the focus be on the women who were exploited, or should we celebrate the scientific progress that emerged, regardless of the cost? It's a difficult question, and one that we are still grappling with today. But one thing is certain: Anarcha's legacy, and the legacy of all the enslaved women like her, must be remembered. They are a part of medical history, even if they were never given the chance to tell their own story. As we begin to understand the contributions of Anarcha Westcott and the other women who were exploited in Sims' experiments, it's important to recognize the lasting impact their stories have had in shaping modern discussions about ethics in medicine. In the decades following these brutal experiments, the medical field slowly began to evolve, driven by the need to protect patients' rights, ensure informed consent, and avoid the kinds of exploitation that were rampant in earlier centuries. Today, we see a world where medical ethics have advanced considerably. Informed consent is a standard practice, and the rights of patients are protected by laws and regulations. Yet, these protections exist because of the dark history that came before them. The suffering of women like Anarcha became the catalyst for many of the medical reforms we take for granted today. Their pain, and their silence, set the stage for a future where autonomy, consent, and respect for all patients' dignity became foundational principles in medicine. But while these changes have been significant, there are still echoes of this dark past in the medical field. The history of unethical experimentation is not just a relic of the 19th century. In fact, in the 20th and 21st centuries, there have been numerous instances of medical research conducted on marginalized populations without proper consent, examples that show how far we still have to go in eradicating the legacy of exploitation in medicine. Historians still argue whether we've truly learned from the mistakes of the past. Some believe that the history of medical experimentation is a necessary and unavoidable part of medical progress. Others feel that the continuing power imbalances in the healthcare system, particularly in terms of race and class, mean we still have much to learn. As we move forward, it's critical to keep Anarcha's story, and the stories of all those who suffered, at the forefront of our conversations about medical ethics. What's clear is that as medicine continues to advance, we must remember the price at which it came. The questions raised by the exploitation of enslaved women in the 19th century are just as relevant today. Are we truly protecting the vulnerable, or are we repeating the mistakes of the past? As we reflect on the activism surrounding Anarcha's story, it's impossible to ignore the broader societal changes that have been sparked by the fight for justice in medical history. The effort to right the wrongs done to Anarcha and the other enslaved women used in Sims' experiments is part of a larger wave of social justice movements that have sought to expose and confront the systemic inequalities in healthcare. This includes not just the racial and gender inequalities that Anarcha faced, but also the exploitation of other marginalized groups whose bodies were subjected to unethical medical research and treatment. Modern-day medical ethics, which emphasize consent, patient autonomy, and the right to make informed decisions about one's own body, are direct responses to these historical abuses. But even as these principles have become foundational to medical practice, the legacy of medical exploitation continues to impact marginalized communities. In fact, studies have shown that people of color and low-income individuals are still more likely to be subjects of unethical medical research, to receive inferior healthcare, and to experience medical discrimination. These disparities are deeply rooted in a history of exploitation and mistreatment that stretches back to the time of Anarcha and beyond. But activism and advocacy have given rise to significant changes in the way we think about healthcare and ethics. Movements like Black Lives Matter, as well as the ongoing push for health equity, have challenged us to confront the historical injustices that continue to reverberate through healthcare systems. The awareness raised by these movements has led to reforms in both healthcare policy and the way medical research is conducted. Increasingly, patients have a say in their treatment, and informed consent is taken more seriously. But there's still much work to be done, especially when it comes to ensuring that medical institutions are held accountable for their past wrongdoings, and that future generations of medical professionals are taught to recognize the ethical pitfalls that can come with progress. Historians still argue whether the progress we've made in the fight for medical justice is enough. Have we truly reckoned with the past? Or are we simply moving forward without fully confronting the painful history that has shaped modern healthcare? The debate rages on, but what's undeniable is that the legacy of Anarcha and the other enslaved women is not just a thing of the past. It's something that continues to inspire calls for a more just, ethical, and equitable healthcare system. As we explore the ways in which the legacy of Anarcha and the other enslaved women has been overlooked, it's also important to consider the role of activism in reclaiming these forgotten histories. Over time, a number of historians, social justice advocates, and even some within the medical field have worked tirelessly to bring Anarcha's story to light. By shedding light on her suffering, they've helped reframe the narrative surrounding the history of gynecology, one that for too long has been dominated by the voices of those who benefited from the exploitation of vulnerable populations. In recent years, there has been a concerted effort to finally give Anarcha the recognition she deserves. Some activists have proposed memorials in her honor, including statues, plaques, and even dedicated spaces in museums. These efforts have not been without resistance. Some argue that such gestures are too little, too late, or that they don't truly do justice to the magnitude of the harm that was done. Others suggest that instead of focusing on the creation of memorials, the focus should be on changing how we approach medical ethics and justice today. This is where the conversation takes on a more personal and reflective tone. How do we, as a society, reconcile the need to honor victims like Anarcha without diminishing the work she was tragically forced into? What does justice look like in this context? Some believe that acknowledging the pain, suffering, and contributions of these women, and ensuring their stories are told, can help heal some of the wounds left by their exploitation. Others argue that justice can only be achieved through systemic change in the medical field that guarantees equal rights and dignity for all patients, particularly those from marginalized communities. One thing that's certain is that the activism surrounding Anarcha's story is part of a larger movement to reclaim the history of Black people in the United States, particularly their contributions to fields like medicine. Many of these stories have been lost to time, buried beneath layers of systemic racism, colonialism, and oppression. As we begin to unearth them, we start to see the true scope of the injustice these individuals suffered, and the extent to which their sacrifices shaped the world we live in today. Historians still debate whether public acknowledgement can ever truly make up for the harm done. Will statues and memorials do enough to right the wrongs of the past, or are we simply performing an act of cultural redemption? It's a question without an easy answer, but one that calls for continuous reflection. As we think about the lasting impact of Anarcha's story, it's essential to consider how her life and suffering have reshaped our understanding of consent and ethics in medicine today. The conversations surrounding her exploitation by Dr. Sims have played a crucial role in pushing medical institutions toward a more ethical framework. But have we done enough to ensure that history is not repeated? The history of unethical experimentation on marginalized groups, especially women of color, continues to echo in modern society, and Anarcha's story is a reminder that we must remain vigilant in protecting the rights of all patients. In recent years, there has been significant progress in recognizing the importance of patient autonomy, particularly in the field of gynecology. Ethical reforms, including mandatory informed consent and more rigorous regulations for medical research, have helped shape a healthcare environment that strives to protect individuals' rights and dignity. But these reforms are far from perfect. The healthcare system is still rife with racial, gender, and economic disparities, and while many strides have been made, there is still much work to be done to create a truly just and equitable medical field. The story of Anarcha reminds us that the fight for justice is not just about recognizing past wrongs, but about ensuring that these wrongs are never repeated. It's about creating a healthcare system that values the dignity of every individual, regardless of race, gender, or socioeconomic status. While the memory of Anarcha's suffering has sparked an important dialogue about medical ethics, we must also look at the present and future of healthcare, ensuring that all patients, particularly those from marginalized communities, are treated with the respect, care, and autonomy they deserve. Historians and ethicists still argue about the extent to which modern healthcare systems have addressed the historical abuses that occurred during the 19th century. Some argue that the reforms made since then are sufficient, while others believe that true justice has yet to be achieved. In either case, Anarcha's story continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the cost of progress, and the responsibility we have to honor the memories of those whose suffering helped pave the way for the advances we benefit from today. As we bring this journey to a close, let's take a moment to reflect on the true legacy of Anarcha Westcott. Her life was marked by unimaginable pain and suffering, yet her story has begun to reverberate through the corridors of history, slowly pushing us to confront the uncomfortable truths about the cost of medical progress. Anarcha's name may have been lost to history for far too long, but in uncovering her story, we've learned not only about the cruel realities of 19th century medicine but also about the strength, resilience, and quiet defiance of those who were never allowed to speak for themselves. In many ways, Anarcha's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Her ability to survive the brutal experiments of Sims and endure what no human should have to endure is a stark reminder of the injustices inflicted upon enslaved people. It's a testament to her strength and to the strength of all the women who, like her, were subjected to medical experimentation without their consent. Their bodies, their pain, their humanity, too often denied, have now come to stand as symbols of resistance, even if they never had the opportunity to voice it themselves. As we move forward, we carry the responsibility of ensuring that the wrongs of the past are never repeated. We must continue to examine the ethical standards in medicine, not only to protect the rights of patients today but to honor those whose suffering was essential to the progress we benefit from. Anarcha's legacy reminds us that there is still work to be done in the fight for justice and equity in healthcare. In this quiet moment, as we reflect on the lives and contributions of those like Anarcha, we must also ask ourselves, how do we ensure that their stories are remembered, and that their suffering is not forgotten? The fight for justice does not end with recognition, it continues through action, advocacy, and most importantly, a commitment to ensuring that everyone's voice is heard and respected. Anarcha's voice may have been silenced in her lifetime, but it is now speaking to us through history, urging us to never forget. So, as we conclude tonight's journey, let her legacy remind you that the struggle for justice is ongoing, and that the fight for dignity, equality, and human rights belongs to all of us, no matter where we come from or the battles we face. Rest well, knowing that stories like Anarcha's are the ones that shape us, even if they have been long forgotten. We carry them forward, because they never truly fade.